Every morning you wake up and your organs are already working. Your liver has been processing metabolic waste through the night. Your kidneys have been filtering your blood. Your heart has been maintaining circulation through every sleep cycle. Your brain has been consolidating memories, clearing cellular debris through the glymphatic system, and managing the hormonal transitions that move you from sleep to wakefulness. Your digestive system is preparing for the first inputs of the day. Your adrenal glands are executing the cortisol awakening response that is supposed to prime your biology for the demands ahead. All of this is happening before your alarm goes off, before your feet hit the floor, before you make a single conscious decision about how you are going to treat your body today. And then you wake up. And within the first 60 minutes of consciousness, you do three specific things that your organs have to work against rather than with. Three things that are so normalized by modern morning culture that most people have never once questioned whether they are appropriate. Three things that the research now shows are generating cumulative organ stress that compounds quietly across years and decades before it announces itself as a diagnosis that your doctor will treat with medication rather than tracing back to the morning habits that created the conditions for it. I'm Dr. Julian Cross, and in this video, I'm going to walk you through exactly what those three morning mistakes are, precisely what they are doing to your liver, your kidneys, your cardiovascular system, your brain, and your endocrine system, and exactly what to replace each one with so that your morning routine starts working for your organs rather than against them. This is not about optimization. This is not about biohacking. This is about stopping the daily organ damage that millions of people are inflicting on themselves before 9 a.m. without any awareness that it is happening. Stay until the end, because mistake number 3 is the one that the medical community is only beginning to fully understand. And in my clinical opinion, it is doing the most widespread and the most serious organ damage of the three. Welcome back to the channel. If you are new here, I am Dr. Julian Cross. And this channel exists to give you the medical and physiological education that the healthcare system does not have the structural capacity to deliver in the time it has available with you. Today's video is built around a specific and practical focus. The first 60 minutes of your day and the three behaviors that most adults perform during that window that are generating chronic organ stress through mechanisms that are well characterized in the peer-reviewed literature, even though they are almost never discussed in the clinical context where they would be most actionable. I am going to be specific about the mechanisms. I am going to explain what is happening at the cellular and organ level because I believe that understanding the biology is what transforms information from interesting to motivating. When you understand exactly what your liver is doing when you make mistake number 1, you will not need a motivational framework to stop doing it. The biology will be motivation enough. Standard disclaimer before we begin. This is educational content based on peer-reviewed research and clinical observation. It is not personalized medical advice. Please work with your physician on decisions specific to your health situation. Now let us get into the 3 morning mistakes that are slowly destroying your organs. Morning mistake 1. Dehydration ignored. What happens to your organs in the first hour without water? The first morning mistake is not drinking water immediately upon waking. And I want to be precise about why this specific mistake matters at this specific time of day, because the general advice to drink more water is so ubiquitous and so vaguely delivered that most people have stopped actually hearing it. The biological context of waking up is unique in the entire 24-hour cycle, and understanding that context is what makes the dehydration issue at this specific time so consequential for organ function. When you wake up after 7 to 9 hours of sleep, you have been without fluid intake for the entire duration of that sleep. Across those 7 to 9 hours, your body has continued every fluid-dependent process without replacement of the fluid being used. Respiration alone loses approximately 200 to 400 milliliters of fluid through exhaled water vapor overnight. Sweating during sleep, even without the obvious sweating of a hot night or a fever, loses additional fluid through insensible perspiration. Urine production continues during sleep through the night, although at a reduced rate due to the action of antidiuretic hormone. By the time you wake up, the average adult is in a state of mild to moderate dehydration that is so consistent and so universal that we have normalized it as simply how the morning feels, rather than recognizing it as a physiological state that requires immediate correction before any other morning behavior. Now let us talk about what this dehydration state is doing to your organs, specifically during the period when most people are ignoring it and reaching for coffee, checking their phones, or jumping immediately into their morning routine without addressing it. The kidneys. Your kidneys filter approximately 180 liters of blood per day through a process that is entirely dependent on adequate blood volume and blood pressure to drive the filtration pressure across the glomerular membrane. When you are dehydrated, blood volume decreases. When blood volume decreases, the kidneys respond by conserving water through the action of antidiuretic hormone and by activating the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system to raise blood pressure and maintain filtration pressure. In the short term, this compensatory response protects kidney function. But here is what most people do not understand about their morning kidney biology. The kidneys are doing concentrated filtration work in the morning hours in a lower blood volume environment, while simultaneously receiving the first metabolic loads of the day from a body that has been catabolizing tissue and accumulating metabolic waste products overnight. Morning urine is dark and concentrated, not because it is normal and healthy for kidneys to produce dark, concentrated urine, but because the kidneys are working hard in a fluid-restricted environment to maintain excretion of accumulated waste. Chronic morning dehydration, meaning the consistent pattern across months and years of not correcting the overnight fluid deficit before beginning the day, is associated in the epidemiological literature with elevated risk of kidney stone formation, reduced long-term kidney filtration capacity, and accelerated decline in glomerular filtration rate in middle-aged and older adults. The kidneys are doing their hardest work of the day in a dehydrated state, and then immediately receiving the additional metabolic processing demands of the waking day on top of that work, without the fluid support they require. The solution is specific: 500 milliliters of water consumed within the first 15 minutes of waking, before coffee, before food, before anything else. Not sipped slowly across the morning, consumed deliberately and promptly to correct the overnight fluid deficit before the kidney workload of the waking day begins. This single behavior change produces measurable improvements in morning urine osmolality, kidney filtration markers, and the downstream energy and cognitive function that adequate blood volume supports. The liver. The liver performs the majority of its detoxification and metabolic processing work during the overnight fasting period, when it is not competing with digestive demands for blood flow and metabolic resources. By the time you wake up, the liver has accumulated the products of that overnight processing work and is ready to clear them. This clearance process is significantly water dependent because water is the primary medium through which the liver's processed waste products are transported to the kidneys for excretion. When you wake up dehydrated and do not correct that dehydration promptly, the liver's clearance pathway is compromised. The processed waste products that should be moving efficiently from the liver to the kidneys for excretion remain in circulation for longer periods. The liver has to continue working against a fluid deficit that limits its processing efficiency for the first hours of the day. There is also a glycogen regulation aspect to morning liver physiology that most people have never considered. The liver maintains blood glucose through the night by releasing glycogen stores during the fasting period. By morning, the liver's glycogen reserves are partially depleted, and the organ is in a state of metabolic transition as it shifts from fasting glucose maintenance to responding to the first dietary inputs of the day. This transition is more efficient when blood volume and hydration status are adequate because the hormonal signaling that manages the transition, particularly insulin and glucagon, operates more precisely in a well-hydrated metabolic environment. The cardiovascular system. Morning is the peak period for cardiovascular events. Heart attacks, strokes, and sudden cardiac events occur at higher rates in the morning hours than at any other time of day, and the physiological reasons for this are well understood and directly relevant to the dehydration discussion. Blood is more viscous when dehydrated. Increased blood viscosity raises the workload on the heart, increases the tendency for platelet aggregation, and elevates the risk of clot formation in the same vessels that are simultaneously experiencing the morning surge in blood pressure and heart rate that accompanies the cortisol awakening response and the transition from horizontal sleep to upright activity. The combination of morning blood pressure surge, elevated sympathetic nervous system tone, reduced blood volume from overnight dehydration, and increased blood viscosity creates a cardiovascular environment that is measurably more hazardous than any other point in the daily cycle. Correcting the dehydration component of this risk profile is a simple, free, and immediately actionable intervention that reduces one of the modifiable factors contributing to morning cardiovascular risk: the brain. Cognitive performance is measurably impaired by even mild dehydration at levels as low as 1 to 2% of body weight. The brain is approximately 75% water by volume, and its electrical and chemical signaling processes are highly sensitive to changes in hydration status. Morning dehydration directly contributes to the brain fog, the slow cognitive startup, the difficulty with focus and attention, and the general mental sluggishness that most adults experience in the first hour of the day and attribute to insufficient sleep, rather than recognizing it as a correctable dehydration effect. Research studies that have specifically examined cognitive performance before and after morning rehydration show measurable improvements in reaction time, attention, memory recall, and processing speed following the consumption of 500 milliliters of water in the morning compared to baseline dehydration. The brain fog you are treating with coffee every morning is partly a caffeine deficit and partly a water deficit. Addressing the water deficit first, and then the caffeine need, produces significantly better cognitive outcomes than addressing the caffeine need in a dehydrated state. What to do instead? The protocol is simple, costs nothing, and takes approximately 60 seconds to execute. Place a 500 milliliter glass or bottle of water on your bedside table before you go to sleep. When your alarm goes off and before you reach for your phone or move toward coffee or begin any other morning behavior, drink it, all of it, within the first 10 to 15 minutes of waking. This one behavioral change, implemented consistently, will produce noticeable improvements in morning energy, cognitive clarity, kidney function markers, and cardiovascular parameters within 2 to 4 weeks of consistent practice. It is the single highest return on investment morning intervention available, and it is free. Morning mistake 2. The breakfast you are eating is destroying your pancreas and your liver. Mistake number 2 is the breakfast that the majority of adults are eating. And I want to be direct and specific here, rather than offering vague guidance about eating healthier, because the mechanism I am about to describe is precise enough that vague guidance is genuinely insufficient. The most common breakfast pattern in the modern developed world is high in refined carbohydrates and low in protein and fiber. Cereal with milk, toast with jam or a sugary spread, a pastry with coffee, a muffin grabbed from a coffee shop, fruit juice consumed in the belief that it represents a healthy choice, flavored yogurt marketed as nutritious but containing as much sugar as a candy bar. These are the breakfasts that millions of adults consume every morning while believing they are making reasonable dietary choices. And every single morning they are generating a metabolic event in the first hour of the day that is slowly and systematically destroying the organs responsible for managing that event. Let me explain exactly what happens. The pancreas. When you consume a high refined carbohydrate breakfast after an overnight fast, your blood glucose rises rapidly. Rapidly is the critical word here. Refined carbohydrates, meaning carbohydrates that have been stripped of the fiber that would slow their digestion and absorption, are broken down into glucose and absorbed into the bloodstream at a rate that the body was not designed to manage on a daily basis. The pancreatic beta cells, the specialized cells in the islets of Langerhans that produce and secrete insulin in response to rising blood glucose, respond to this rapid glucose rise with a large and rapid insulin secretion. This is called the first phase insulin response, and it is designed to manage exactly this kind of glucose challenge. In a young, healthy, insulin-sensitive individual, it works efficiently. The insulin is secreted, it binds to receptors throughout the body, glucose is cleared from the bloodstream, and the system returns to baseline. But here is what chronic daily repetition of this pattern does over months and years. Beta cells are metabolically expensive cells that consume enormous amounts of energy in the process of producing and secreting insulin. When they are required to mount large first-phase insulin responses daily, multiple times per day, for years, they experience cumulative metabolic stress that progressively impairs their function. Research shows that chronic dietary patterns that consistently produce large postprandial glucose spikes are associated with progressive beta cell dysfunction and reduction in beta cell mass over time. Beta cell loss is irreversible. Once beta cells are lost, they do not regenerate in any clinically meaningful way in adult humans. The progressive loss of beta cell mass and function is the mechanism underlying the development of type 2 diabetes, and it begins not with the diagnosis, but with years of metabolic stress accumulation that predates the diagnostic threshold by a decade or more in many patients. Your morning breakfast is not just a meal. If it is consistently high in refined carbohydrates, consumed in the absence of adequate protein and fiber, it is a daily beta cell stress event that is contributing to the progressive decline of the organ that manages your blood glucose regulation for the rest of your life. The liver. The liver processes a significant proportion of the glucose load from every meal through a process called hepatic glucose uptake. When the postprandial glucose spike from a high carbohydrate breakfast overwhelms the body's immediate glucose disposal capacity, the liver converts the excess glucose to fat through a process called de novo lipogenesis. This fat is initially stored in the liver itself, and over time, with chronic daily repetition of high glycemic breakfast patterns, this hepatic fat accumulation is the direct mechanism underlying the development of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is now the most common liver disease in the developed world. It affects approximately 1 in 4 adults globally. It begins with the silent accumulation of fat in the liver cells called hepatic steatosis and can progress through stages of increasing inflammation and fibrosis towards cirrhosis and liver failure in its most severe presentations. And in the vast majority of cases, its development is directly connected to the chronic dietary pattern of repeated large carbohydrate loads driving repeated de novo lipogenesis in the liver. Most people with early non-alcoholic fatty liver disease have no symptoms. The liver does not have pain receptors in the way that other organs do, and damage can accumulate significantly before any clinical sign appears. The first indication many patients receive is an incidental finding on imaging performed for another reason, or mildly elevated liver enzymes on a blood panel that gets attributed to other causes without adequate dietary investigation. The insulin resistance connection. Beyond the direct organ damage to the pancreas and liver, the chronic high glycemic breakfast pattern contributes to the development of systemic insulin resistance through a mechanism that involves the downregulation of insulin receptors across peripheral tissues. When insulin levels are chronically elevated because the dietary pattern is consistently producing blood glucose spikes that require large insulin responses, the cells of the muscle, fat, and liver tissue respond by reducing the number and sensitivity of the insulin receptors on their surface. This is a protective adaptation against chronically elevated insulin signaling, but it has the consequence of requiring progressively higher insulin levels to produce the same glucose clearance effect. Insulin resistance is the upstream metabolic condition that drives type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, polycystic ovarian syndrome, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and is now being increasingly studied as a significant contributing factor to Alzheimer's disease pathology. What to eat instead? The breakfast that protects your pancreas and your liver is not complicated or expensive. It is a meal that contains 30 to 40 grams of high-quality protein, adequate dietary fat to slow gastric emptying, and fiber from vegetables or whole food sources. It is a meal that produces a modest and gradual blood glucose rise rather than a spike. And it is a meal that gives your beta cells a manageable and sustainable workload rather than demanding a large and stressful insulin response before you have been awake for an hour. Eggs cooked in any form with vegetables. Greek yogurt without added sugar, combined with nuts and berries. A protein smoothie made with whole food ingredients. Smoked salmon with avocado. Cottage cheese with whole grain crackers and vegetables. None of these require elaborate preparation. None of them are expensive relative to the cost of the chronic disease that the alternative is contributing to. And all of them will produce measurably different blood glucose, energy, and cognitive performance outcomes across the morning compared to the refined carbohydrate breakfast that most adults are currently consuming. Morning mistake 3. What you are doing to your brain and your endocrine system in the first 15 minutes of consciousness. This is the mistake I mentioned at the beginning, the one that the medical community is only beginning to fully characterize in terms of its organ-level consequences. And it is the behavior that is almost certainly the most universal among everyone watching this video. You are picking up your phone within the first few minutes of waking. I know that sounds like familiar advice territory. The no phone in the morning message has been circulating in wellness content for years, and most people have heard it enough times that they have stopped registering it as anything more than a suggestion they probably should follow, but do not. So I am not going to deliver this as wellness advice. I am going to deliver it as organ physiology, because that is what the research now supports, and it is significantly more serious than the wellness framing has communicated. The brain. When you wake up from sleep, your brain is in a specific and carefully orchestrated neurological transition state. The prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for executive function, rational decision-making, impulse regulation, and the modulation of emotional responses, is not fully online in the first 15 to 30 minutes after waking. This is a normal and well-documented feature of the sleep to wakefulness transition called sleep inertia. The brain is still cycling down from the oscillatory activity of sleep toward the higher frequency activity of full wakefulness. During this window, the amygdala, your brain's threat detection and emotional processing center, is relatively more active relative to prefrontal cortical modulation than it will be once the prefrontal cortex comes fully online. This means the first 15 to 30 minutes after waking is the window when you are most emotionally reactive, most susceptible to anxiety provocation, most likely to have emotional responses to incoming information that are disproportionate to what rational prefrontal processing would generate. Picking up your phone in this window and exposing your amygdala-dominant brain to the specific content environment of social media, news, email, and notification feeds is the neurological equivalent of throwing accelerant on the emotional processing system that is already at its most reactive point in the daily cycle. The amygdala processes incoming stimuli for threat content before the prefrontal cortex has the opportunity to modulate the response. Social media content is algorithmically optimized to produce engagement through emotional activation, which means it disproportionately contains content that triggers the threat, fear, outrage, and comparison responses that the amygdala generates. News content similarly skews toward threat-relevant information because threat-relevant information captures attention more reliably than neutral information. Email presents unresolved demands and obligations that activate anticipatory stress even when the individual emails are not themselves urgent. All of this arrives in the brain during the window when the prefrontal cortex is least capable of providing rational modulation of the amygdala's responses. The result is a neurological stress state that is established before full wakefulness is achieved, and that research shows influences the stress reactivity pattern of the entire subsequent day. The adrenal glands and cortisol. The cortisol awakening response is one of the most important and most precisely calibrated endocrine events in the human daily cycle. In the 30 to 45 minutes following waking, cortisol levels naturally rise to a peak that is approximately 50 to 100% above the baseline sleeping cortisol level. This peak is not a stress response. It is a precisely orchestrated hormonal preparation for the metabolic and cognitive demands of the day. It primes the immune system. It prepares the metabolic machinery for the transition from fasting overnight to active daytime function. It supports the cardiovascular adaptations required for upright activity. It calibrates the brain for alertness and executive function. The specific timing and magnitude of this cortisol awakening response is influenced by behavioral inputs that occur immediately after waking. Light exposure, movement, and the psychological content of the first minutes of consciousness all modulate the cortisol awakening response in ways that have downstream effects on the entire day's stress hormone pattern. When the first psychological input of the day is the anxiety-provoking, comparison-generating, demand-presenting content environment of your phone, the cortisol awakening response is amplified beyond its natural calibration. The HPA axis receives a psychological stress signal that adds to the natural cortisol rise and pushes cortisol levels higher than the calibrated awakening response alone would have produced. This amplified morning cortisol spike sets the HPA axis into a state of heightened reactivity that persists through the morning and into the afternoon. Research on diurnal cortisol patterns shows that the cortisol awakening response magnitude predicts the stress reactivity profile for the subsequent hours. Start with a larger than appropriate cortisol spike, and the nervous system is primed for elevated stress reactivity throughout the day. The physiological consequences of chronic cortisol excess, which I have discussed in detail in previous videos, include immune suppression, insulin resistance promotion, hippocampal atrophy, cardiovascular risk elevation, and accelerated biological aging through telomere shortening. You are programming your stress hormone system for the day in the first 15 minutes of consciousness. The phone is not a neutral input in that window. It is an HPA axis activator operating at the most sensitive point in the cortisol cycle, the dopamine system. Beyond the cortisol consequences, the immediate morning phone check produces a specific and consequential effect on the dopaminergic reward system that shapes motivation, focus, and pleasure capacity across the entire day. Social media platforms, notification systems, and news feeds are designed by teams of behavioral engineers specifically to maximize dopamine release through the delivery of intermittent variable rewards. The unpredictable nature of what you will find when you open your phone, whether it will be an interesting piece of content, a positive social response, important news, or a notification that requires action, is the same psychological structure as a slot machine. Intermittent variable reward schedules are the most powerful reinforcement mechanisms known in behavioral psychology. When the dopaminergic system receives a large stimulation from this highly engineered reward environment in the first minutes of waking, it calibrates the day's reward sensitivity to that elevated baseline. The natural rewards of focused work, meaningful conversation, physical movement, and creative engagement feel comparatively flat and unstimulating against the dopamine response that the phone delivered before the day began. This phenomenon is one of the mechanisms underlying the attentional fragmentation, the difficulty with sustained focus, and the pervasive low-grade dissatisfaction that researchers studying smartphone use and well-being are documenting across multiple population studies. You are calibrating your brain's reward system to a level of stimulation that your actual life cannot consistently match in the first minutes of every day. And then you wonder why everything else feels less interesting and less engaging than it should. The heart. The cardiovascular consequences of the morning phone check are not limited to the cortisol-mediated blood pressure elevation described above. There is a direct and rapidly acting autonomic nervous system component. When the sympathetic nervous system is activated by the psychological stress content of the phone in the first minutes after waking, heart rate increases, blood pressure rises, and the balance of the autonomic nervous system shifts away from the parasympathetic restoration mode of sleep toward a sympathetic activation state more rapidly and more dramatically than the natural waking transition would produce. This abrupt sympathetic activation in the morning occurs in the same cardiovascular environment described in the dehydration section above. Lower blood volume, higher blood viscosity, and natural morning blood pressure surge. Adding a psychological stress-mediated sympathetic spike to this environment produces a morning cardiovascular load that is greater than what the natural waking physiology generates, and that contributes to the peak in cardiovascular events that research documents in the morning hours. In people with underlying cardiovascular disease or cardiovascular risk factors, this amplification of the morning sympathetic surge is a clinically significant risk factor that deserves explicit clinical attention. In younger, healthy adults, it is contributing to the progressive elevation of baseline cardiovascular strain that accumulates across years of daily repetition. What to do instead? The protocol for correcting morning mistake number 3 is not complicated in terms of what it requires. It is only complicated in terms of overcoming the behavioral habit and the social expectation that the phone demands immediate morning attention. No phone for the first 30 to 60 minutes after waking. This is the specific window during which the cortisol awakening response completes its natural arc. The prefrontal cortex comes fully online. The dopaminergic system calibrates to the natural reward environment of the morning, and the cardiovascular system completes its transition from sleep to wakefulness without the amplification of a psychological stress input. What fills that 30 to 60-minute window is less important than the consistent absence of the phone. Drink your 500 milliliters of water. Get outside for 10 to 15 minutes of natural light exposure without sunglasses, which anchors your circadian rhythm and supports the natural cortisol awakening response. Move your body in some form, even briefly. Eat your protein-anchored breakfast. Have your coffee at 90 minutes post-waking after the cortisol peak has begun to naturally decline, as I discussed in my previous videos. This morning window without the phone is not a productivity sacrifice. It is the 30 to 60 minutes during which your brain, your adrenal glands, your cardiovascular system, and your dopaminergic reward system complete the transitions they need to complete to support a day of stable energy, clear cognition, resilient stress responses, and sustained focus. Every day you give your organs that window, you are investing in the biological capital that compound across years. Every day you deny them that window because checking your phone felt urgent, you are making a withdrawal from that biological account. The complete morning organ protection protocol. Let us bring the three corrections together into the practical morning framework that implements everything covered today. Immediately upon waking, drink 500 milliliters of water before any other behavior. This is non-negotiable and takes 60 seconds. First 15 minutes, no phone. Get outside or near a window for natural light exposure. Move your body even briefly. Allow the cortisol awakening response to complete its natural arc without amplification from psychological stress inputs. Within the first 60 minutes, eat a protein-anchored breakfast of 30 to 40 grams of protein with adequate fat and fiber. No refined carbohydrates consumed alone without protein and fiber buffering. Protect your beta cells in your liver from the daily glycemic stress event that most people are imposing on them before 9 a.m. Between 60 and 90 minutes post-waking, have your first coffee after the cortisol peak has begun to decline. Not before, not on an empty stomach. After water, after movement, after light, after food. That is the complete morning organ protection protocol. 4 steps. 30 to 90 minutes of implementation time. Zero cost beyond the behavioral shift required to implement it consistently. And a return on that investment that compounds across every organ system in your body across the years and decades of daily repetition that follow. Your organs are not passive structures waiting for something to go wrong. They are dynamic, adaptive biological systems that respond to every input you give them. Every morning, every decision in that first hour, every glass of water you drink or skip, every breakfast you build carefully or assemble carelessly, every 15 minutes of phone-free waking biology you protect or surrender. The mistakes I have described today are not exotic or unusual behaviors that require special circumstances to produce harm. They are the default morning behaviors of the majority of adults in the modern world, which is precisely why the chronic disease patterns they contribute to, the kidney decline, the liver disease, the metabolic dysfunction, the cardiovascular risk, the neurological deterioration, are themselves the default health trajectories of the majority of adults in the modern world. Default is not destiny. The morning routine is one of the most controllable variables in the entire health equation. You set it, you repeat it, and the biology it produces compounds across the years with a fidelity that rewards the right habits with extraordinary consistency. Start tomorrow morning. One change. Drink the water first. Let that be the change that makes the next one easier, and the one after that easier still. I am Dr. Julian Cross. If this video gave you something useful, share it with someone whose morning routine you think might be costing their organs more than they realize. And I will see you in the next one.